In the beginning, God. Now, two stories, big stories, compete for the human mind in our culture. Two great stories about life, existence, and the universe. Two stories that both agree that the universe is intelligent, it is comprehensible, and behave in a law-like manner. Both stories agree that the universe actually reveals a series of startling coincidental events or physical fine-tunings that provide for biological life as we know it. Actually, Stephen Hawking says it this way: the discoveries relatively recently of the extreme fine-tuning of so many laws of nature could lead at least some of us back to the old idea that the grand design is the work of some great designer. And then he adds, this is not the answer of modern science. Well, we all knew that by now, don't we? This is not the answer by modern science. Now, the scientific story, or naturalist story, as we have seen, is attempting to explain everything in terms of a basic grid or set of laws, which he calls the grand design, while the other one, that is the biblical story, seeks to explain everything we observe as the result of cosmic intelligence. This is and remains the deep divide in our culture up to this very moment. So, we are living at the crossroads, which we all live at, and we all have to make our choices as we encounter the two roads. So every worldview has a story about everything, and every worldview will have a story about the beginning of everything. The one story talks about creation, the other one talks about a Big Bang. And the biblical story here is no exceptions to that rule. It simply states its first principles up front. We read it about the world, about life, about existence, and the Bible is not shy about it. It states it up front. Whoever composed the biblical universe or biblical literature, they were very conscious of stating it up front. Whoever wrote the Mosaic literature placed its first principle at the beginning as a preamble to everything that follows. And you don't need to read very far in what follows until you realize that this beginning story is the logical key to everything that follows. First of all, this beginning story will draw a deep line in the sand between the idea of a creator and creation. And that in turn will draw a deep line between what is called the Hebrew worldview and all the other Near Eastern, should I say, contemporary worldview of the biblical authors. I don't think we who live today really appreciate, how radical a divide exists between the Israelite worldview that draws a line between creator and creation, and all the other ancient views. People from Egypt to Babylon or Greece and Rome imagined that all the forces of nature were gods, ruling the universe and thus human destiny. And they worshipped nature, such as the sun, the moon, the stars, and the planets. They named even the weekly days according to their gods. Thus, they also practiced what we call astrology. And we encountered today, it's simply the application, the practical application of the beliefs that the heavenly bodies, they rule our destiny. So the Israelite beginning story is a radical no to the Near Eastern worldviews, where they saw the moon, the sun, and the planets as gods. In the Israelite understanding, they are not gods. They are part of God's creation. The later Greek idea that natural law will govern the cosmos has very clearly grown in, should I say, the garden of the Near Eastern cosmology and their nature worship. The difference here is that the Ionian philosophers depersonalized the planets, the sun and the moon, and instead replaced them with what they considered to be natural laws. A view of the universe that has actually re-emerged full force within the last 200 years within our modern culture and science. So the ancient conflict between Jerusalem and Athens has returned full force in modern times, only to be sharpened and refined in the titanic struggle that we have experienced for the last 200 years. The issues are sharp and they're clear. Is the universe, life and existence to be understood by cosmic forces like natural law, or are they to be understood as the result of intelligence? An intelligence which, according to the Hebrew story, is before everything else, and is actually seen as being personal, even benevolent. Let us read the text in the beginning story. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was formless, in Hebrew tohu, and void vabohu. And darkness covered the deep, while a wind from God swept over the waters. So this initial state of our world was a deep, dark, swirling mass of matter, emitting no light, and impenetrable for any light, just like Jupiter and Saturn is today, not fit for any biological life as we know it. How long this dark spot in the universe existed before God actually decided to turn it into a green-blue living space is, according to this story, an open question. But what follows in the story is simply a description of the steps that God took in order to form this dark place into a blue-green living space. And step one is like this. He said, let there be light, and there was light. So the first actions of God is to allow light to penetrate through this mass of matter. Now, then he begins shaping what we call heaven and earth, according to the text. We read, God separated the waters that were under the dome from the waters that were above the dome. God called the dome sky. So what we are seeing here is that the chaotic matter was divided into two related parts. One was called heaven or sky by God, and the other one was called earth. That which is above and that which is below. That is the visible sky and the visible earth is here seen as two dimensions of the one single living space that we call the world. This is an important thing to notice, because these expressions, heaven and earth, will turn up later on in the story as code words. So having separated what is above from what is below, God then takes another step. Having separated the above from the below, God then made another separation as we read. Let the waters under the sky gather together in one place, and let the dry land appear. God called the dry land earth, and the waters he called sea. So this is about turning, should I say, the initial chaotic mud pool, as we read about in the beginning, into some solid land on the one side and a liquid space on the other side. Something like this, something what the geologists today would call the supercontinent surrounded by one ocean. A continent that they call the Pangea. One continent, one ocean. The later continental breakups that geologists can observe is associated with the mega volcanic activity is a subsequent development and story. So the story is about how God turned this initial chaotic mass into an ordered space. So we can ask the question, what is the purpose of what God is doing? Now, God's intentions become quite clear very early as we read. Then God said, let the earth put forth vegetation, plants yielding seeds, and every kind of fruit trees of every kind. So God wants to fill this space with living things. This is simply the beginning of what we could call a biosphere. Here the focus is on vegetation. This is the first thing that is mentioned. And the kind of biological life that is driven by what we today call photosynthesis. So the role of the sun and the moon is then next the object of God's action, as we read. Let there be light in the dome or of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them be signs for seasons, days, and years. Now, we have already seen that God divided the initial pool of matter into what we call sky and earth. Two dimensions, above and below. And now he further shapes the sky to serve life on earth in establishing the essential biorhythm, the day, the year, and the season rhythm, which is essential for biological life. Having done this, God then fills the air and the sea and the earth with living creatures, as we read. Next step. The next step, God said, let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures, and let the birds fly about the earth across the dome of the sky. This is a description of what we call advanced biological life. So now living beings are in the sea and in the sky, but that's not the end. God hasn't finished yet. We read that the next step is that God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures of every kind, cattle and creeping things and wild animals of the earth of every kind. So, by now, we see that God is seen as the author of all biological life in all its potential diversity. This is the idea. But that's not the end of the story. Actually, the remaining 1/3 of the story of creation zooms in on the creation, the origin, and purpose of human beings as in God's plan for this world. As we read, then God said, let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion. If we had heard this for the first time, it would have hit us like a great surprise, even a disturbing surprise. It's actually repeated again in the text to emphasize its importance. That's a normal Hebrew way of doing it. When you want to focus and zoom in on something of importance, you repeat it and you keep repeating it. He said, God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. To be created in the image of God, at a very minimum, seems to imply that humans have something in common with God. Somehow God is the benchmark for what humans is something that apparently can qualify them for the unique role that he has in mind for them, which we haven't heard of yet, but which is coming. 1/3 of the story is devoted to defining the origin and the being and the role of humanity in the world. As we read, humans are seen as unique, they are seen as extraordinary, they are seen as godlike. And yet, they are seen to be formed out of matter. Like everything else from the dust of the earth we are going to read in the story, and like everything else, they are being animated by God. So even when they have something in common with God, they are not seen as divine beings, but dust beings belonging to the sphere of creation. That's something we need to observe. They are given, however, a unique central role in the governance of this world. Now we read, to hold dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds in the air and over the cattle and over all wild animals on the earth. So to hold dominion is clearly some kind of regulatory governmental function or biological life. I think this is a minimum. A function that is emphasized again by yet another repetition. And God said to them, fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish, the birds and every living thing. And we ask, why this dominion? Does nature not work as a self-regulating machine, as the naturalists are actually saying it is? Apparently not, when you read this story. It took intelligent activity on the side of God to turn this swirling mass of matter into a blue, living, green space. And it apparently takes continual intelligent activity to maintain it as such. That seems to be the plot of this text. Order is not automatic when you read the biblical creation story. Chaos is automatic when things are left to itself. It takes intelligence to maintain order, according to this story. So the first principle of the biblical beginning story should not come as a surprise that the natural order is not seen as a self-generating, self-regulating organism, but rather as a divinely designed, regulated organism. The real surprise when we read the story is that God turns over some of the management of his creation to humans as his governmental agency. The governance agency, that is to power share with humans, for that involves a potential risk when he does that. If humans mismanage, if they fail to image God in their activities and therefore fail to manage according to God's life-supporting values, what then? Even if they take a destructive approach to this management. So let's sum it all up. What we have seen so far is that God is turning this dark swirling mass of matter into a green-blue living space. First, he forms a geophase. This is the first part of his creative activity. Then follows a biophase, where he fills the geospace with life. And then finally, we have the human phase, where he turns over the regulative activity to humans. Now, while the creation of humans could be called the crowning act of God's creation. Some do. This is disputable. It is by no means the finishing act that God is performing, because we read the following: "Thus the heavens and the earth was finished, and all their multitude, and the seventh day God finished the work he had done." So the finishing act of God is not the creation of humankind, but something that follows immediately on the heels of the creation of humankind. And whether the word finish actually refer to God's last act in creating the vast universe is completely open question as far as this text is concerned. What is quite clear is that this is the finishing touch for this world. The very plot of the creation story is moving towards this climax. We further read, "So God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, because on it God rested from all the work that he had done in creation." Holy times, that's the first time we hear about holy time. But I can assure you this is not the last time that we are going to hear about that in the biblical story. Those familiar with the biblical world of thought knows very well that when something is hallowed, consecrated, be it a person, place or time, it means that God is choosing to occupy that part of creation in some special way. And such a language makes actually perfectly sense in the biblical world of thought, because here God is not seen as being part of creation itself, but distinct from it. So when God had completed the heavens and the earth, framing this world, he immediately decides to occupy part of its time cycle. He consecrated the seventh day, that is, he occupied this part of human time, because that's what it is, earth time. That is, time where God is the prime object of attention. Now, to give God the attention is, in the larger biblical story, called to worship. So it should not surprise us that the seventh day Sabbath rests in the subsequent biblical story was reserved for personal and community worship of God. Now, the central theme in the first four of the Ten Commandments is all about worship, especially the fourth one. A commandment that takes its origin from the biblical beginning story. That's where it originates. And it highlights who to worship, how to worship, when to worship, why worship. So the subsequent story is highlighting the plot of the beginning story, namely that the purpose for which God is setting off time in the beginning, namely for communion with God. Now, humans need this, apparently, in order to fulfill their role in creation, in order not to mismanage. And Jesus is highlighting the same point when he said the following: the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. He's thinking all the way back to the beginning story, before the disruption story came, before everything went wrong. In other words, he's saying there is something about the Sabbath rest that is beneficial for human, yes, even necessary for human beings, even in the paradise order in the beginning. So here we shall simply suggest that communion with God is the biblical recipe for human spiritual formation. And communion with God is something that takes time. It takes plenty of time. Uh, it takes regular time. It takes repeated time. And God is seen here as setting time off from the beginning for a particular benefit for human beings. We need it. God does not need it. We need it. So, Sabbath, just to preempt our later discussions of it, seems to be about a person-building worship or communion with God. A community-building worship. God wanted humankind to build a community, multiply and occupy, he said, and occupy the world, build a community. And apparently God wants this community to be based on the internally shared values of love that God possesses. And the not-so-secret recipe for such a spiritual formation is apparently communion with God. And God sets time off for this purpose. In other words, God wants us to sing the same song as He is singing. The song about love. First sung by God in the beginning. And here we hear what the song is that unites the story. God saw everything that He has made, and indeed it was very good. 5 times He repeats it. It's good. And the 6th time He actually said it is very good as we read. It's just right. This is just the way it should be. So from the very beginning, you encounter a radical definition of goodness as the unifying theme of the story. You have not yet heard about evil. You haven't heard about violence. You haven't heard about disease. You haven't heard about death yet. Everything is presented as being in a perfect, life-supportive order. Very good. That's the song God is singing, and He wants humans to sing the same song. Nature reflects God's goodness. Nature is apparently balanced in such a way that it reflects the essential character of God, His wisdom, His design, His intent. God appeared to be the great X factor who alone knows exactly how the forces of matter should be balanced in a life-supporting ecology. He seems to be the master of that. Humans reflect God's goodness and wisdom and insight, and is apparently equipped by God to be His regulatory agency in upholding and completing, should I say, the completion of this planet. God is seen as benevolence and the benchmark for the goodness of creation, and thus the author and the upholder and sustainer of what we could call a perfect paradise life. This is what the story is about. How He did it is not explained in this story. It's not what the story is about. The story is about, it's not a course in physics, it is not a course in astrophysics, nor is it a course in biology. The logic of the story is that order, a benevolent order, a life-supportive order, is not something automatic. It's something that is initiated by a benevolent, intelligent being called God. Furthermore, the story also indicates that this design process was quick and not slow. It was a quick and not a slow emerging process. But when we read on in this story, we discover, sadly, that this ordered paradise life is not going to last. This order is soon to be disrupted. Humans are going to mismanage. With life-changing, nature-changing effects of the worst kind. So what geologists today see when they study our planets is no longer the world as it was from the beginning, according to this story. What biologists observe and what is happening in the world of biology is no longer the ecology that was put in order from the beginning. And when psychology studies the mind of humanity and the motivation of humanity, it is no longer the human psyche as it was from the beginning. So the paradise life form, as it was from the beginning, is now a lost land, according to this story. And the story of disruption will be the subject of our next presentation, which we call The Crisis in Paradise.